guessing a lot of you who are tuning in maybe have already installed Windows 8. I have Windows 8 on a different machine. I'm in the process of putting it all together, so I'm actually going to be running this presentation on Windows 7. So let me just get my slides up here. I thought they were already up, sorry. Let me just launch into this real quick. There we go. There we go. Yeah, last minute name change you guys probably heard about here, right? So Metro was the key name that we were told for quite some time about the look and feel of the Windows 8 UI, and that has some weird stories now about possible trademark infringements and whatever else, so we can also just call this the modern user interface if we want to. Now, this presentation is something I gave a couple months ago. We had an open house here at Intertech to celebrate our 20th year, and this is kind of a retelling of that story. So you'll see little traces of the word Metro in here, but we all know what that's really referring to. You know, whatever the current buzz term is kind of irrelevant. Metro just meaning the new look and feel for the Windows operating system. Okay. All right. So unfortunately, I won't be able to hear you guys through any kind of audio device. So again, if you do have some questions, go ahead and text me, or you can send an email. Like I said, I'll give my email address later on. All right. So what are we going to talk about here? Well, I wanted to try to kind of get us all into the mindset of Windows 8 programming from 3 different perspectives. And I think they're all very important to keep in mind, because if you haven't played with Windows 8, it is different. And I'll tell you right now, it's definitely quite different. So we're going to look at just a little bit, on kind of like the user's perspective, and that would include us, right? You know, how things are going to be quite different for us. Then, of course, we'll try to hit more on things that we developers might be curious about. And one thing which is pretty surprising is that when you are building a Metro-style application, aka a Windows 8 application, you're actually not doing pure .NET programming. There's a whole different stack of technologies that are used to build up a Metro-style app, but it's kind of a weird story because there is a subset of .NET that is given to us, and we can still use C#, and we can still use Visual Basic, and we can still use C++. And on top of that, we could also use HTML5 and JavaScript. So in some ways, it's going to feel very similar to building a .NET application, but there's a whole different technology stack in the background, and also kind of a whole different way we have to go about building such a beast, right? And then we'll also talk a little bit about the business perspective, but I'm not going to be going down the road of marketing or even sales per se, more about that crazy idea of the Windows application store, right? The Windows store and how our applications can get uploaded and what kind of vetting process they have to go through. So hopefully, regardless of your background, by the time we're done here, you'll at least get a few nuggets that might be helpful to you. So let's kind of begin real briefly here on the user perspective. I'll date myself. I guess, what am I now? I'm 43 years old. So when I first started doing professional programming, like for actual money, I guess things were all back to Windows 3.11, right? And that was a whole different world. And I remember when Windows 95 came out, it was like this big, amazing new user interface, right? So up on top here, we have a little screenshot I found online for Windows 95. And that's really where we got the introduction for the good old start menu. And through various iterations of Windows, all the way up to Windows 7, things have kind of been pretty much the same, right? I mean, they have new infrastructure, new services, and maybe make it look a little more, appealing to the eye, but it's kind of been the same thing, which is not necessarily bad. But that really, really does change in Windows 8. And it's not just the way it looks upon startup, it's actually the way we interact with this whole idea of just navigating through our systems. This is sort of the new normal, right? When you first start up Windows 8, and by the way, I got to say, kudos to Microsoft for really, really improving the boot time. It's really nice. This is the whole new quote-unquote start screen, okay? And so what you see here is a sequence of tiles. These are called live tiles. And they're called live tiles for a reason. These tiles are kind of living, breathing creatures that actually are doing things in the background. So just by way of a quick example, if we had a tile on here for maybe stock quotes, we might see real-time updates on stock quotes. Or even here in the screenshot, a little picture of a Windows weather application. You know, that could be changing as the tile page is currently up. Okay. Now, one of the things which takes a little getting used to is that the Windows 8 operating system, it's really, really optimized for touchscreen devices. So if you had a tablet PC, using your hand to swipe through all the tiles and zoom them in, zoom them out, and rearrange things is pretty darn fluid. The same thing can be done with a mouse. Maybe a little more to futz with at first, at least I found that to be true for myself. Now it's feeling fairly natural, but it does work just fine with mouse interface as well. Okay. Now, these application tiles are just the launching point. So if we were to click on any one of these tiles, we would launch what we used to call the Metro style app. Now it's just the modern user interface. And some of the big differences, and we'll talk about more specifics as we go, but you know, full screen, much more focus on content, much less focus on Chrome, right? And we'll talk about that Chrome distinction in just a minute here too. Okay. Now another thing which is pretty interesting is that when you are running a Windows 8 application, specifically a Metro style application, you know, that really does play by a whole different set of rules. We do have this full screen support. We're able to tap into some Windows 8 features on these little decorations on the side, for example, but they run side by side with a quote-unquote normal non-Metro Windows application. And as you can see in that screenshot in the lower right, it is completely possible to actually have both things side by side, right? And that's called the snap feature that we'll talk in a little more detail about as we go too. This might look familiar to some of you because if you've been watching different Microsoft UIs in different products, they're all kind of adopting the same similar Windows 8 look and feel. So I'm not sure about you guys, but when I can, I try to spend a little time playing video games. So here would be a little screenshot of the Xbox UI. Windows Phone, right? Similar tiled infrastructure. And of course, this is Windows 8. Now, one thing which is really nice, though, is that with Visual Studio 11, it is now possible to build something called a portable library project. Let me just fire that up real quick so you can see it. So I'll just launch up the latest version of Visual Studio. So if we were to go under File, New Project, let's go to C# perhaps, right here, Portable Class Library. Now, as you can see from the description over here, this allows us to build a DLL that can run under a number of different Microsoft environments, which is like really awesome. So if you wanted to build up a set of domain objects or common data crunching routines or common bits that you want to share across platforms, this is your safest way to go. And let me just show you why. I'll call this maybe port lib. So notice what we can see right away is I can specify which frameworks I want to support. Got to make sure we get Xbox in there too, right? So I click OK. And now, as we're going to see, if we go under the References folder, so I'm on the upper right of the IDE right now under the Solution Explorer, this is a little different than what we're kind of used to, right? Under earlier versions of Visual Studio, the References folder would show you every single library that you're referencing. Here we have this thing called the .NET Portable Subset. If I were to just open up the object browser, excuse me, now I can start to view the different subsets. So what I'm trying to basically illustrate here is that when you make this particular library type, you're going to be restricted on what it's possible to include in the project. So if you're referencing some library that would only work under .NET proper and it wouldn't work at all under Silverlight, that's not going to be made available to you. So that's great, because I mean, just something as minor as this can be really helpful when we're trying to make sure that we're building a truly portable set of libraries. So if I were to come over here to the add reference area, you'll notice how some things are all dimmed out, right? And that's where it's just kind of saying, nope, can't get there. That's not going to work on every single version. So clearly the portable library would not be a good choice for, maybe building a whole bunch of custom controls, because that can't be guaranteed to be portable across everywhere. But this is more for like domain objects, business objects, utility classes, things like that. So that can be very helpful. Okay, so what is this whole Metro app idea then? Well, I've already showed you a teeny bit, right? It's very different from a user's perspective because it is going to be, by default, kind of taking up the whole entire screen. And as I mentioned, there's a lot more emphasis on the content. The content is front and center. Many tools that we have today, many different applications that we install, they can be quite focused on Chrome, right? 20 different toolbars, really complex menu systems, status bars, dockable toolbars, and so on. And here, again, the content is really front and center. And that really kind of forces us to even ask a really basic question. Does my application make sense to be a Metro-style app? I say some applications don't make sense. At least I haven't seen it yet. Someone could certainly prove me wrong. But when I think about some tools, like I think about a tool like Photoshop, or I think about a tool like Expression Design or Expression Blend, those tools really need a lot of Chrome, right? Those tools really aren't necessarily all about the content. They are about the services they provide. So my take right now, and again, this could change over time, but I'm thinking, well, there is a certain time and place for the Metro-style app, and there's a certain time and place for a traditional application. And thankfully, both things run under Windows 8. Okay? So one of the big differences you'll notice right away is if you click on your Windows button on your PC and you have Windows 8 installed, no start menu. I'm sure you're all aware of that. It's really more of a toggle now between the default start screen and the desktop. And that alone can take a bit of getting used to. So if I can just go back here real quick, I don't have anything shown, but if I were to keep scrolling here, I would eventually start to see tiles for basic Windows programs like Visual Studio or Microsoft Word. And if you click those, it wouldn't go into a Metro-style look and feel by default, right? You have to program for this kind of thing specifically. It would just launch the normal application on the desktop. As I kind of alluded to, the part that's a little bit weird is that when we are building a Metro-style app for Windows 8, it's going to feel similar to what I'm assuming a lot of you online have already been doing, right? I'm assuming most, if not all of you, are .NET developers, so you're aware of the tools that we use and the languages that we use and the different installation things that we go through, config files and whatever else, right? Well, you can absolutely just use all of your .NET skills to make a .NET program for Windows 8, but you're not making a Metro-style app. You're just making an app for the Windows operating system, okay? So what makes these Metro apps different? Well, let's just formalize this idea of the Chrome versus the content. This is a very, very common kind of a typical Windows app, right? The content, as you can see, at least from this app, right, not really front and center. A majority of what we see here is all the decorations, which are typically called the Chrome, okay? Remember, some applications absolutely need this, and that's totally fine. But this kind of would go against the philosophy of making a Metro-style app, where we want the content to be front and center. Now, I'm not sure if any of you were able to get to the latest Build conference. A lot of good talks there. And Jensen Harris had a presentation where he kind of gave out these 8 core traits of a really successful Metro-style app. And I'm going to kind of go through these points pretty much piece by piece, trying to focus more on developer concepts, okay? And we'll just kind of go through these from top to bottom here. Okay, so again, the Chrome will be kept to a minimum. So here's a good side-by-side comparison. So over here on the left, we have an RSS feed kind of written for a traditional Windows environment. And over here, we have a Metro version of an RSS feed, right? As you can probably tell, and I'll be honest here, I've never called myself a graphical artist. I can make really nice-looking stick figures and happy faces maybe, but I'm not the guy you want if you want a beautiful, gorgeous-looking user interface, right? I need a little help from my graphical artist to make it look real eye-catching. So that's one thing to definitely be considerate of, right? Because the content is going to be so front and center, we certainly have plenty of layout managers to do complex data bindings. We have all that kind of good stuff. But this is something you might need to consider at your place of work, Might it be important to hire the services or to work in conjunction with graphical artists? We will all probably find that's going to be a little more necessary than when we're building a traditional non-Metro app, right? Now, again, there's plenty of libraries and templates and helpers to make it look pretty darn good, but keep that in mind because, again, we're going to be really focusing on really capturing graphics, clean presentations, and so forth, okay? Where we used to have all the menu systems, all the options, and so forth, we're going to actually be able to leverage the operating system of Windows 8 to kind of work with some of that. And if I can just go back a few slides again. I think there was a screenshot that kind of illustrated that. Yeah, like here. When we're building a Metro-style app, we can actually tap into services of the Windows operating system to go ahead and allow searching through our app. We can share parts of our app to maybe online services, right? So there is a way for us to hook into the OS layer too. Now, as far as application services, well, yes, you can certainly have that too. You can see that over here with categories. But even that would be a good example of kind of a re-envisioned menu system, right? Okay, so that's the first kind of key point. We're going to be keeping content front and center, keeping Chrome to a minimum. And this little screenshot here, I was just kind of Googling away one day and looking for some good screenshots that maybe illustrate the point that maybe the whole world is not going to be building Metro apps. Some kind of applications just need the Chrome. And I think these are a couple of good examples of some tools that do need the Chrome, right? One way that might be helpful to think about Windows 8 applications, they kind of like a smartphone application, right? Like I got my smartphone here in my hand right now. I just picked it up. And if I launch an app, it's going to be taking over the full screen. It kind of shares resources with other apps on my phone. I can cycle between the apps, right? But there's always kind of one guy front and center. And that's sort of how we play around with the Windows 8 mindset. I mean, the user can flip between them, but something's going to be taking that front and center stage. Now, the other thing, too, which is very important for developers to grasp early on, is that if you are going to be working on a Metro-style app, and again, for those that joined me late, I did acknowledge earlier about the name change from Metro. I still call it Metro. But we need to think about touchscreen programming because that is a really key part of getting through the vetting process. We need to make our applications responsive to input through user interaction, okay? And so there's actually a whole little touch language that we can program with, okay? In the screenshot here on the screen, it's hard to illustrate this unless you can touch the screen and try it yourself. But I bet a lot of these things are familiar to you guys just with your phones, right? It's not just enough necessarily from a UI perspective to say, well, if I move my finger to the right, it slides. This is also where we're going to have to start thinking about things like animations. And, one of my big things that I try to push when I teach WPF classes is I really encourage developers to get out of the mindset of thinking that animations and graphics are just for building multimedia programs. You know, when you're doing anything with XAML, those things become front and center because we have to use those things. We have to use animations and we have to use graphics to incorporate visual cues for templates, to stylize data bindings, and to have smooth transitions. And the smooth transition part is going to be critical when we're programming for touch. If you've ever tried to do animation programming yourself with XAML, if you're just like bound and determined not to use Blend, and you just start typing away in Visual Studio, you will eventually get horrible hand cramping. Writing animation sequences on the fly in XAML is not pretty. Even with the newest version of Visual Studio, which has much, much more support for XAML, there's still no animation editing support beyond typing in the editor. And maybe now more than ever, Expression Blend is going to be really important to have some really good tool support to help us with these different transition effects. Okay, and I really hope that you guys have checked out Expression Blend. I used to be a pretty big naysayer about it. Then I too got horrible hand cramps, and I eventually jumped on board, and now I really like it a lot. I can't imagine not doing a XAML project without it. Okay, now this little idea of being fast and fluid, great marketing buzzword, it actually has kind of dipped into the languages themselves. .NET 4.0 permanent not to use Blend, and you just start typing away in Visual Studio, you will eventually get horrible hand cramping. Writing animation sequences on the fly in XAML is not pretty. Even with the newest version of Visual Studio, which has much, much more support for XAML, there's still no animation editing support beyond typing in the editor. And maybe now more than ever, Expression Blend is going to be really important to have some really good tool support to help us with these different transition effects. Okay, and I really hope that you guys have checked out Expression Blend. I used to be a pretty big naysayer about it. Then I too got horrible hand cramps, and I eventually jumped on board, and now I really like it a lot. I can't imagine not doing a XAML project without it. Okay, now this little idea of being fast and fluid, great marketing buzzword, it actually has kind of dipped into the languages themselves. .NET 4.5 introduced a few new keywords to both C# and Visual Basic. And if you guys have been following the story of all the different releases of .NET, you probably remember that, some releases like 3.5, we just had a huge number of new language features. Pretty much all of them were there to support LINQ. And then in .NET 4.5, the languages didn't really get too many new features themselves, right? But we did get these guys, async and await. Two new keywords that are available in both C# and VB, which are really awesome. What Microsoft has basically done is they have introduced in these languages keywords to work with asynchronous calls. Now, working with asynchronous calls has always been, I would say, has always been easier under .NET than other systems I've worked with. Even back in the first release of .NET when we had asynchronous delegates, that was pretty sweet. And the threading library was pretty sweet. And then as .NET has kept marching along, we eventually got the task parallel library. Well, these keywords are going to be tapping in to the TPL. In fact, when we build up methods that are marked async, we typically make use of the task class. Okay? And let me actually flip over to Visual Studio again and just give you a little taste of how these new keywords can really help build out. And this is not something which is just for Windows 8, by the way. Remember, I'm running Windows 7, so I'm going to actually run a program right now that'll run under Windows 7. It would also run under Windows 8. But I'm going to tap into some of these new keywords here. Okay, so here's a super common situation. You have a user interface for the desktop. It doesn't matter if it's Windows Forms or WPF. Here I just use Windows Forms because it's just a little bit easier to talk about just the code than worry about the XAML. And you have this very common situation where you say, well, gosh, if the user clicks a button, I know I'm going to enter a long-running computation. And the last thing we want to do is have the primary thread locked up. So this is where programmers would start to write multi-threaded code. You still could certainly do that, but nowadays we have actual language support. So let's take a peek. Basically here I got 3 buttons, right? And that just illustrates 3 different ways to use these new keywords. And I got a text box. So if I have more than one thread doing the work, I should be able to be typing in this text box while the work is happening in the background, right? That's the idea. So let's just kind of take a peek at some of this. And I think I'm going to start down, let's see if I can remember my buttons here. Let's start with this one. Yeah, this guy here. Okay. So if the user clicks this button, I want to start a task asynchronously. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to mark this method with the async keyword. And look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to set the text property of the window to the return value of this method, but I also decorate it with the await keyword, right? So basically, I'm going to start this task asynchronously, so the primary thread is free to do his work, and then when the return value comes back, eventually, the text will be set for me, okay? So this method right here, you can see that I'm leveraging the task class of the TPL. And remember, my ultimate goal is I'm returning a string, but because he's set to an await request, I'm returning a task of string. Now, this little code example is pretty simple, but it does kind of assume you've worked with the TPL before. If any of this is like, what does all this mean? Don't worry about that. I think when you see it running, you'll get the gist of what's happening. But you can see when I run my task, I'm going to force the calling thread to wait for about 10 seconds. Now, again, if this was a single-threaded program, I would be locked for 10 seconds, right? Maybe I'll make that 5 seconds just so we're not waiting here for 10 full seconds. Let's make that 5 seconds. 5 seconds. And then eventually I do return an actual string. So let's do that first one. I'm going to click my button, and I'm typing away. And eventually we should see, yep, the title just updated. The next button I want to show you here is just multiple awaits. So again, here I've marked this method with the async qualifier. And here I just want to spin off a series of different tasks, one after the other. Same idea where I'm just going to put that thread asleep. So this guy's going to wait around for 2 seconds, this one for 3, this one for 6. And again, I'm going to be setting the text of the window with the custom message. So let's try this. So let's keep your eyes up here, of course, right? I'll click this little button here, type away, and eventually third task should be done. There we go. Now, this is pretty tremendous to me because, notice what we're not having to do here. We're not having to do a bunch of anonymous delegates for the secondary thread to get back to the calling thread. I'm not having to say, this dot invoke and then, worry about that on the UI thread. We get a lot of support from the framework now to do this. And again, this to me is just awesome. I remember back in my day, I remember writing all the threading code with the Win32 API in C, and boy, oh boy, that was not quite as simple as it is nowadays. I bet you I still have code out there some poor person is still trying to maintain. So it's always great when we get help at the language level. Cool. So I just want to give you a quick little example of these keywords doing some useful things for us. Oh, and here's just a quick little screenshot that reminds you of that. And then there's just the example of the code. Now let me talk about this next point. Remember, I very, very briefly mentioned this idea of snap. So because Windows 8 is really geared towards a large variety of devices, we have to keep in mind that, well, I have to make sure that my application scales to different resolutions. Good news, of course, for those of you that have been working with XAML-based APIs, vector graphics, that's a good thing, right? So we do get a lot of help just out of the box from that. And here are just some common sizes for a Windows 8 application. Now, here's one thing that you'll find very bizarre. I remember when I first got my hands on some pre-release drops of Windows 8, I put it on my test machine, and I'd noticed that I'd be clicking all my tiles and nothing would happen. I didn't get any indication things would fail, just nothing would launch. So, of course, I go to the internet, start to search around, and it turns out if you are not in the correct resolution, your Metro-style apps will not launch. So there is a baseline, right, that the computer is expected to be in, and then a whole bunch of other resolutions that you can scale up or down to. So if you ever get to that situation where you're like, man, I'm clicking on my tiles here, and it just does a indentation of the tile, but the program never starts up, I would probably guess the chances are pretty good you're not in a fitting resolution. The snap part of this point is something which is also new. Metro-styled apps are required to snap. What does that mean? Well, like in Windows 7, how there's that wonderful feature where you can drag an application to the side of the desktop and it kind of connects to the side of the desktop. Really handy for having a side-by-side view of maybe, I don't know, Visual Studio and Blend or something. Kind of the same idea in that we can, for lack of a better term, dock or snap an application. But look at the difference. Okay, we can run a Metro-style app in its full state. The snap state is meant to almost be sort of like a subset of the UI, kind of distilled down to the bare pieces. So it's almost like a second view of your data, and of course that should ring out to you guys as MVVM, right? We can go ahead and leverage MVVM to have different views of our data. We can have a snap state and a full state. And it's meant to be a fully functional version of the whole application. You might have some, pieces that the user can't see directly, but it's not like going to go into some kind of suspend mode. It's still a usable application, just not going to show all the UI pieces. And that's what this whole snap idea is. Now, of course, with every release of a new technology, we have to have oodles of new buzzwords. And one thing that you'll probably bump into is the idea of Windows 8 contracts. Okay, so this is, in one case, contracts are ways for Windows applications, Windows 8 applications, to communicate between themselves and share different services. And I showed that screenshot earlier of searching in your app for something. Okay, well, that's just one tiny example. The Metro APIs, and I'll actually define that in a little bit, we have tons of predefined contracts that we can crack into, right? So, for example, if you were building up a Metro-style app, you could say, well, my application wants to tap into the share contract. So I have a uniform API to upload parts of my app to some kind of a social media site, for example, right? You might decide to tap into the search contract, okay? Now, here is where you have lots of creativity. You're not going to be required to use every contract that the OS supports. You kind of want to have the right tool for the job mindset. I've already mentioned this as part of pretty quick here, but these tiles, remember, these are meant to be alive. They are actually kind of consuming some CPU resources because they are going to typically be maybe pulling in data from an external site for updates, right? Like a rolling list of incoming emails or an update to the weather, okay? Now that's not going to be the case though for a Windows 7 app installed under Windows 8, meaning a non-Metro app, right? So the tile for Visual Studio is not going to do anything. It's just going to look like an icon for Visual Studio. But if you are building a full Metro app, that's another thing to keep in mind and to consider, right? And we're almost done with these principles, then we'll start talking about some actual APIs, right? Cloud storage is going to be a big, big part, okay? Reason is because, remember, Windows 8 is meant to be runnable and usable on a super wide variety of devices. So if you write an app and I download it to my PC and I like it a whole bunch and I also download it on my tablet, then no matter which device I'm using, ideally, of course, I'm hitting the same application data. And so that's where we're going to be bumping into cloud-based services, right? So that's another thing that we're going to need to be jumping on board of, typically, to really kind of make a nice quality Metro-style app. And then also the final little piece to just be aware of is that don't make the eye candy there for the heck of it, right? We're trying to make a pretty clean user experience, and that's, again, where tools like Blend can really help us, and possibly the services of a graphical artist. Now, let's get down to some more code bits, okay? I mentioned earlier that if you're a .NET programmer today, you're going to have an excellent head start. Maybe even more specifically, if you're a .NET programmer who's worked with XAML before, you're going to have a really excellent start. So even though we can still work with XAML, C#, etc., we really are not building a prim and proper .NET application. We're building something called a Metro application, or modern UI application. So we have been given a whole new stack of libraries, okay? In addition, though, we do get a subset of the .NET platform that we can use to build Metro-style applications. And here's a nice roll-off-your-tongue term for you, right? .NET APIs for Metro-style apps. Now that they changed Metro, I guess they'd probably call it .NET APIs for Windows 8 style apps. That seems to be the new term now for Metro. Okay. Now remember, this is a subset. So you cannot guarantee if it worked on the desktop, it's going to work under Metro, right? Perfect example. When you're building out the user interface for a Metro style app, you're not doing WPF proper. You're using XAML, and it's going to feel like a WPF in some cases with layouts and so on, but you actually are tapping into a whole different stack of libraries, okay? So let's first talk a little bit about this little subset of .NET. It is definitely meant to be a lean and mean subset. Pretty much anything with UI pieces has been stripped out, controls and windows and layouts. Things are much, much more generalized, things like collections and link support and some core security libraries. Input support, right? So you see this guy down here for system.windows.input. So we do get support for all the touchscreen input, for example, okay? And this little screenshot might be misleading because I think you might have seen this if you just go to MSDN. You might look up system.collections, but if you expand the node, you're going to see that it's actually a superset for a whole bunch of sub-items, right? So if you were to actually go through each one of those over here on the right, you'd see quite a number of different namespaces, right? Now, all these different namespaces, they use system as the root, just like we're used to under .NET, okay? But when it comes to all the pieces that are very particular to Windows 8, like the UI, the contracts, tapping into the cloud, tapping into the services, that is actually Windows Runtime. Okay. So this is again where we take a really hard turn from traditional .NET programming. And this is where we tap into a whole bunch of services of the runtime, a whole bunch of new APIs that are only usable from a Metro-style application. In fact, I can't even show you these on this machine because I have Windows 7 installed. So if I go back to Visual Studio 11, it doesn't even show me any of the Metro templates, right? Now, you will see some common naming conventions. So all these Windows runtime libraries, they just use Windows as the root namespace. Remember back over here on the .NET stack, we're going to use system as the namespace. Okay? So what kind of things do the Windows runtime libraries show us and give us? Well, plenty of ways to consume data in a whole variety of formats. Again, if you've worked with WCF before, some of this will look and feel familiar. We have a whole bunch of stuff for working with devices of the machine, right? So like geolocation. If you have a tablet, you can tap into different sensors, right? You know, tilt and so forth. We also have tons of different things for multimedia. Now remember, if you're going to be saying, yes, we are committed to Metro, you will be building eye candy. So the media namespaces are pretty useful. And that's obviously just a subset of what WinRT brings us. Here's a more complete picture of some of the things that we might get. I don't expect you guys to read all this verbatim. Let me just try to break down some of the big things to consider. This is the whole set of technologies for the actual UI. So again, if you're a WPF person or if you're a Silverlight person, you would now be using these different windows.ui.something to build out the UI. And you can see that a lot of our old friends are here. We have a XAML incarnation, right? We have a whole bunch of controls that automatically take on the Metro style look and feel, right? We have a whole set of animation services, which are very similar to the WPF animation services, okay? And then if I come over to the right-hand side here, plenty of things for graphics that work in conjunction with that. And then even more pieces here for working with user interactions beyond what we get from the .NET subset. So, for better or for worse, we're back at the bottom of the mountain, right? We can certainly leverage our skills, but yep, there'll be a whole new stack of libraries to dive into and see what's going on with. If you prefer to work with web technologies, then you're also in the game. One thing which I think is pretty interesting is you can build out your Metro style apps using HTML5 for the UI and using JavaScript for your application logic. So this is pretty compelling, you know. I've typically found that programmers are really in one of two camps. I mean, either you're going to commit your talents and your time to being a web person, or you commit your talents and your time to being a desktop person, because there's such dramatically different ways of programming, right? And both of these ways of programming are just so feature-rich, and they have so many things to know, it's pretty darn impossible to be an expert at everything, right? I know I'm not. So this is great, you know, if you're currently an OO kind of person, like myself, you can just dive right into your language of choice, and you can tap into all the XAML and go to town, right? We can also, though, as we see here, right, we can tap into the HTML there, JavaScript, and all of our .NET languages here, right? In fact, if you've played around with Blend 5, you can actually build out a Metro-style application. One of your new project choices is if you want to tap into HTML5. So we have really good support there as well. Now, many, many, many moons ago, I was pretty knee-deep in the world of COM. So I was all about implementing IUnknown and making class factories and endless registration scripts for my COM objects. And that just felt like such an old school thing to me, right? Because now, as I've been doing .NET for a number of years, I'm much, much happier not implementing 85 interfaces per class. So I find it really funny that if you start to go way under the covers of how the WinRT runtime is working, these suckers are COM objects. And when I realized this, I just had to give myself a little bit of a chuckle. We typically never ever see it come through in our code because of this projection layer. But all these different services that I was mentioning, like these contracts and, talking to the operating system through the metro layers, you're actually bumping into COM objects in the background. Now remember, COM objects, they had their own form of metadata, right? They had this stuff called a type library that was a compiled version of IDL code. So to express the metadata of the COM object to a way that the metro mindset, the HTML5, the C#, and so forth, the way that they can understand it, is we actually have this registered Windows metadata. And if you start to reference libraries in Visual Studio, you'll notice that you're just referencing this big, huge blob of metadata, right? The actual real functionality of how these objects do their work is actually back there in that lower level COM layer. So that is pretty interesting. So there's a whole bunch of different projections that will map to various languages. All the ones that I just talked about are already in place. And I'm assuming different vendors can make a layer for their own custom languages too, just like we can tap into the CTS to build implementations of, IronPython or Lisp. So for all we know, we might be building Metro-style apps with COBOL, which would be very frightening to me. Okay, so we kind of went through the user perspective a little bit, gave you a little bit of information about the developer perspective. And I think a lot of us would like to stop there because if you're like me, right, we're kind of more interested in twiddling the bits. And we don't often think about the monetary part as far as getting it to market. I mean, we think about it to some level, but I think it's a little bit of a different mindset for a lot of us. Here, though, a little bit more important, I suppose, because if you're going to be building a Metro-style app, your ultimate goal is you want to get that sucker uploaded to the Windows Store, right? And then other folks can have the option of actually purchasing your app, okay? So Microsoft has tried pretty hard, I think, to make this fairly transparent and not too painful. One thing which is pretty nice is that once you go ahead and get your price set in the local currency, the store kind of helps map things to different currencies, which is kind of cool. If you want to get these things uploaded to the Windows Store, for better or for worse, we do need to have a registered app developer certificate. Okay, so that can be a bit of a cost. I mean, for a corporate IT environment, not too terribly painful at all. Even for a single user license is pretty reasonable, This was based on data that I saw a couple months ago. I think it's the same, but don't quote me on the actual cost. But $50 for a year for a person isn't too horrible. Okay. So you got the application done, you have your license, and now you want to upload things. Okay. Well, this is where you're going to have to go through a certification process, right? Now here is a URL, and if you get I think the slides for this are posted. I know the video is going to be posted. But if you just do a, App Store vetting search, you'll probably find the same URL. But basically, your application is going to go through a whole bunch of different tests by those kind folks at Microsoft. And I kind of tried to highlight in red the big things that we need to be aware of. So let me just kind of hit those. The application, this one's kind of like a duh, but you'd be surprised, It needs to be a fully functional app. You can't upload an app that the user can't actually use until they download 75 extra things for cost. it needs to be a fully functional app when they get it. Okay, and that doesn't mean you can't have things they could download later, but we need to make a respectable application, right? There is a one tile per app idea, so there shouldn't be 20 icons on the Windows start screen that represent your app, which is different, right? Because for a traditional distribution of a desktop program under Windows 7, for example, you know, if I just do that right now, if I just go to my start menu, I could go to Visual Studio. I'm going to get a whole bunch of different components, right, that work together to give Visual Studio all of this functionality. So here we're trying to get things isolated to one tile. Now here's another big one, and this has some interesting implications if you ask me. We need to use those APIs that have been deemed worthy for Metro-style apps. So what does that mean about third-party libraries? What does that mean about maybe, well, you know, other frameworks? I'm sure that there's plenty of ways that Microsoft is going to work with that. But basically what this means to us is we need to be careful about any kind of crazy interop situations, perhaps. Remember that touch screen is not optional, right? We do need to have an application that does respond to all those touch screen pieces that I kind of enumerated through in other slides. And the final part is be nice. You know, don't make dastardly, mean-spirited programs, and keep it clean too. Now, Microsoft does give us a full app certification kit, and that's actually installed when you install Visual Studio, and that helps you do some pre-testing, and it will kind of flag out things that are in direct violation of these different principles, sort of almost like FX Cop, FX Cop for profit for a Metro app. So again, you know, Windows 8 is really just around the corner nowadays. I mean, I think we got a week or so until it makes the official drop to the world at large. And so just thinking about you guys kind of going forward, you know, really, if you haven't embraced XAML, now is the time. This will be a really, really critical part of your Metro-style programming. If you're more of a web-minded person, make sure you embrace your HTML5. And really also, maybe more than ever, Blend is becoming, gosh, almost mandatory nowadays. As I mentioned, Visual Studio 11 has a lot of great support for working with XAML, way more than we had in 2010. But it's still not as feature-rich as Expression Blend. Okay, so make sure you dive into your tools and APIs. And then also, of course, take time to tinker around with these new WinRT library stacks. You'll be in familiar territory if you've been doing .NET for a while, but we are definitely operating with a whole different set of machinery here. It's still not as feature-rich as Expression Blend. Okay, so make sure you dive into your tools and APIs. And then also, of course, take time to tinker around with these new WinRT libraries. So just thinking about you guys kind of going forward, you know, really, if you haven't embraced XAML, now is the time. This will be a really, really critical part of your Metro-style programming. If you're more of a web-minded person, make sure you embrace your HTML5. And really also, maybe more than ever, Blend is becoming, gosh, almost mandatory nowadays. As I mentioned, Visual Studio 11 has a lot of great support for working with XAML, way more than we had in 2010. But it's still not as feature-rich as Expression Blend. Okay, so make sure you dive into your tools and APIs. And then also, of course, take time to tinker around with these new WinRT library stacks. You'll be in familiar territory if you've been doing .NET for a while, but we are definitely operating with a whole different set of machinery here. So that's the end of our presentation. There's my email address, atrolson@intertech.com. If you have any follow-up questions for me, please feel free to pop me an email, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Definitely want to thank you guys for taking time out of your day to listen to me blab here for the last hour. Hopefully you found it was somewhat useful. And I'm just going to kind of take a peek here at some questions. See, someone online said, how will the Metro style affect the web applications built in the future? Well, web apps are web apps, right? They kind of play by their own set of rules. So if you were to launch the Internet Explorer Metro Edition, well, then all of a sudden IE would take up the whole look and feel of the Windows desktop, but whatever HTML is returned from the web server is just going to be displayed the way it's displayed. So thankfully, I guess in a way, it's not going to really, from what I know, I haven't seen any kind of weird internal white papers, but no, there's no, you must build your web apps this way now. This is really much more for just the actual Windows 8 operating system. Let's see, another question. In order to test, can you deploy to an actual device? Emulators, yeah, emulators come out of the box. Those are the easiest way to test. But if you have your license, you can actually deploy it to a device too. So that would also work. Here's a great question. Do we need to go through the Windows Store when developing for internal use? The ultimate answer is you won't have to eventually. That was the official word I heard a little while ago. They understand that there's a big need to have a way to put apps up at the store that are vetted like everybody else, but they're just meant for internal use. I'd have to look at the new refresh on that, Jim, because I haven't looked at that particular question for, I don't know, a month or so. But I do know that Microsoft's aware that that's important, and I've been told that they're going to give a solution for that. Let's see, what do we got here? Ooh, for an existing MFC application, can it run on a Windows 8 directly? Well, person after my own heart, I used to do a lot of work with MFC. Remember, guys, that any application that did run under Windows 7 should run just fine under Windows 8. It's just not going to look like a Metro app, right? It'll just automatically load over to the traditional Windows desktop and just run your program as a Windows desktop application. So now, you know, testing would still probably be a good idea, but it's not going to have any bearing on what you have to do for your MFC program. You just make your program, you install it. When the user clicks on the tile, it switches over to the desktop. Let's see, apps can also be tested with your WinNT install, not through the emulator. Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, Brendan had a good FYI for me. That's good to know. The emulator, I guess, is what I've always used. I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying. If you have, when you're writing Visual Studio, when you like do a debug, it'll just launch right into Windows. Absolutely, yes. But if you want to like try to deploy it to a different device, you can use the emulator. So yeah, good point there, Brendan. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for your questions. Thanks for your time. Again, if you want to get a hold of me with another question after the fact, please feel free to send me an email.